Forget the myths. This isn't a story about grizzled old prospectors striking gold or dime novel heroes chasing outlaws. This is the truth of the Montana frontier in 1879, cold, brutal, and indifferent. The air itself was a weapon, carrying the scent of pine and ice, and the mountains were silent judges, measuring a man by his fortitude and his silence. The wind howled through the passes of Wolverine Peak, but to Jacob Vance, its sound was a comfort. It was the honest voice of a world that asked nothing and promised less. A world where survival was the only covenant. The thick logs of his cabin moaned in protest, rattling the crude, hand-fitted glass in the single window. But they held fast, a testament to Jacob's solitary, relentless skill and determination. For 15 years, Jacob had hidden from the world in a small 20-foot cabin, a fortress built of pine, granite, and absolute silence. He was running from a lifetime of grief, the memory of burying his young wife, Mary, and their unborn child in the frozen Kansas earth. He remembered the frontier doctor, drunk and useless, arriving too late, the stench of cheap whiskey mixing with the scent of blood and failure that hung heavy in their small, ruined sod house. Jacob could still feel the excruciating cold of the spade handle growing slick in his hand as he dug 2 shallow graves in the hard, unyielding prairie ground, his muscles screaming a silent protest against the finality of death. The preacher's platitudes about God's plan had sounded like a cosmic joke, a cruel mockery of his devotion. That night, Jacob had methodically burned their little homestead to ash, watching the flames consume every memory, every promise, every last scrap of hope he had ever nurtured, and ridden west until the mountains swallowed him whole, seeking a silence vast enough to drown out the noise of his own sorrow. His life was a perpetual, self-imposed penance. His days were governed by a relentless, punishing routine. Wake before dawn, tend the low-burning fire, feed thunder, check the traps, chop wood until his muscles screamed, eat a meager meal of venison and cornmeal, and sleep. There was no margin for introspection, no space for memory to creep in. His hands, thick with calluses the color of dried leather, were tools, knowing no purpose other than ceaseless work. At 39, the deep lines etched around his eyes told a story of a man far older, a man who had stopped caring about anything beyond the brutal arithmetic of frontier survival, calories burned versus calories consumed, ammunition spent versus game taken. He communicated with the nearest town, Cedar Ridge, only twice a year, ensuring his solitude remained unbroken. He was known to the few locals as the Hermit, a title he wore like a coat of mail. The interior of his cabin was ascetic, a rough-hewn table, a single chair, shelves lined with preserved meat and dried herbs. Above the door, his rifles were mounted on pegs, silent sentinels against the visible threats of the mountain. Every surface, every object, was a product of his own hands, a tribute to his self-sufficiency, a defiant rejection of human need. His horse, Thunder, the only creature he trusted, shifted restlessly in the lean-to, stable built against the cabin's west wall, a reassuring, familiar presence in the vast silence. Jacob's plan was simple: live alone, die alone, and ensure no one could ever betray him with love again. Love was just another word for inevitable loss, a fragile thing that the harsh world would always claim, always take away. He had built his life on solid ground, only to see the ground shift and swallow everything he cherished. He was a sentinel guarding an empty tomb, and his devotion to his solitude was absolute. But one morning, his plan lay shattered. The winter storm had raged for 3 days with a fury Jacob hadn't seen in a decade, a widowmaker storm that threatened to bury the cabin entirely. After the wind died to an exhausted moan, leaving behind an unnatural, deafening quiet, Jacob descended the treacherous road, guided by his horse, Thunder, and an instinct that spoke of calamity. He fought through drifts that rose higher than Thunder's back, the cold air stinging his lungs with every breath. What Jacob found made his blood run cold. A stagecoach lay broken on its side like a child's forgotten toy, half buried in a drift the size of a small house. The wreckage was massive, suggesting the coach had been run off the road at speed, perhaps by something other than the storm. The horses were frozen solid in their traces, their eyes glazed with ice, a silent, macabre tableau. The strongbox was burst open, scattering the debris of interrupted lives, mail, a lady's glove, a child's wooden toy, across the pristine white canvas. Jacob stared at the toy, recognizing the simple, handcrafted design, and the scene suddenly became agonizingly personal, twisting the cold knot in his stomach into a sharp, painful memory of the life he had buried. He found 4 bodies, the driver hanging at an unnatural angle, a guard half buried in the snow, and 2 passengers thrown clear, and 1 life barely clinging to existence. Jacob's rough, calloused hands that knew only the rhythm of the axe and the rifle, pressed against the throat of a woman buried in a snowdrift, piled against a granite boulder. Beneath the fine, soaked wool of her city clothes, he found a faint, impossible pulse. It was a thread of life so thin, so desperate, that it defied all reason. He had to dig her out with his bare hands, the snow burning his skin, racing against the speed at which life was draining from her. He could feel the tiny flutter against his fingertips, a pulse fighting the inevitable cold, a silent command for intervention. In that single desperate moment, Jacob broke every rule he had built to survive. Every logical voice screamed at him, "Leave her, ride back, do not become involved, she will die anyway. You owe her nothing." But his arms were already lifting her, cradling her frozen form against his chest, beginning a desperate race against the clock and the mountain to save the life of a complete stranger. She weighed nothing, a bundle of sodden fabric and frozen flesh, her fine chestnut hair, the color of damp earth, spilling across his shoulder. He managed to mount Thunder awkwardly, cradling her across the saddle, his arm wrapped around her waist, sharing what little body heat he could. The ride back was an agonizing calculation, every step of Thunder through the deep drifts a gamble against hidden ice and their collective exhaustion. Jacob fought the urge to rush, knowing haste meant death for both of them, pushing Thunder to the limits of his endurance while shielding the fragile burden in his arms. He carried her into the sanctuary of his cabin and stripped away the soaked garments that would have killed her faster than any injury. Beneath the torn blue wool, he found layer upon layer of delicate, impractical city attire, a corset, petticoats, lace. The sheer volume of cloth, the complexity of the fasteners, felt like an archaeological dig into a past life, a forgotten civilization. Modesty yielded to necessity, but the trespass felt immense, a violation of his own code, a defilement of his carefully maintained separation from the human world. He wrapped her tightly in his thickest buffalo robe, the one he slept under, and tended the fire until it roared, fighting against the unsettling awareness of a feminine presence in his rigid masculine world. The air filled with the scent of wet wool, pine smoke, and the faint ghostly scent of lavender perfume, a scent from another life, another planet, a world of gardens and drawing rooms that had no place on Wolverine Peak. Hours passed. Jacob sat by the hearth, rifle across his lap, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of the robe, the only sign of life. He found himself counting her shallow breaths, counting them like a rosary, a forgotten ritual of hope and dread. He was angry at himself, furious at the weakness that had led him to intervene, to risk his ordered solitude for a lost cause. She finally stirred, her eyes, green, the color of spring leaves, startlingly vibrant, opened. They were unfocused at first, then sharpened by confusion, and finally absolute terror as they landed on Jacob, a large, looming, wild figure in the dim firelight. "You're safe," Jacob said, his voice rusty and unused to soothing, but firm, attempting to project calm into the charged air. "Your coach crashed. Everyone else is dead. You are miles from town. This cabin is your only shelter. You are alone with me." She scrambled backward until she hit the wall, clutching the robe like armor. "You! Don't touch me! What have you done? Where are my clothes?" Her eyes darted to her steaming garments hanging over the fire, and fresh horror bloomed on her face. Her city mind struggled to categorize. Him, rescuer or predator. The lack of context made him a terrifying mystery. Jacob's patience, worn thin by the intrusion, frayed. "Wet clothes would have killed you. I only did what was necessary. I didn't touch you further than I had to. You owe me your life, not your accusation, madam." The shock faded, replaced by raw, ugly sobs as she realized the finality of the crash. She wiped her face with trembling hands, forcing back the tide of grief and introduced herself as Eleanor Hayes of Boston. She was a woman of wealth and breeding who had fled a suffocating arranged marriage to a man named Richard Peyton. She was running to San Francisco to escape a fate where she was little more than a business asset to settle her family's considerable debts, a piece of property transferred between two powerful families. Eleanor's city composure clashed violently with Jacob's brutal frontier reality. The cabin, no longer a fortress, became a prison where two people, one running from life, the other running to it, were trapped by the mounting snows. Eleanor's presence was like a charge of electricity in the static quiet of his life. The hollow rhythm of his days was broken, replaced by the sound of another person's breathing, another person's restless shifts on the floor below. The very atmosphere felt different, charged with a feminine chaos he had sworn never to feel again. Before we continue this story of desperate risk and high-stakes romance, if you appreciate deep dives into the untamed American West, take a moment to hit the like button below. It helps this channel share the untold tales of frontier courage. We're about to witness how the walls of a mountain hermit begin to crumble, piece by piece, tested by the will of a woman who refused to be broken, and the subtle power of shared endurance. The forced proximity soon began to break down Jacob's rigid walls, but not easily. Their early interactions were a series of brittle confrontations. She demanded clothes, dignity, and a timeline. He gave her necessity, reality, and silence. Jacob found his clothes hanging on her like a child's costume, trousers rolled, sleeves dangling, the flannel shirt engulfing her, but she wore them with a fierce makeshift dignity. "This is intolerable," she declared, though she sat straighter now. Surely a simple rescue doesn't require such primitive arrangements. Back home, this would be deemed an outrage. I feel like a character in one of those dreadful frontier novels, stripped of all propriety and comfort. "You failed to understand a lot of things," Jacob shot back, his voice curt, the edge of his frustration barely contained. "Starting with the fact that you're lucky to be breathing. This isn't Boston. Storms here don't care what year it is. You are not the heroine of a novel. You are a survivor. The rules of propriety do not apply at 10,000 feet. How fortunate for me that a mountain hermit happened along," she countered, her green eyes flashing with the fire of the defiant rich. "Tell me, Mr. Vance, do you often rescue half-dead women, or am I a special occasion? Do you keep a ledger of your good deeds?" "First in 15 years, he said flatly, the words a raw confession of his isolation, and beginning to remember why I stopped. It's too much trouble. Yet, the tension softened into uneasy collaboration. Eleanor was not the fragile socialite Jacob had expected. She was determined, practical, and possessed of a defiant steel. When he offered her the black, bitter frontier coffee, thick with sludge, she sipped it without complaint, noting the lack of sugar. She ate the venison stew with an appetite born of near death, surprising him with her lack of fuss. She questioned him relentlessly about the environment, the weather, and the survival methods he employed, absorbing the reality of her predicament with a keen analytical mind, her fear channeled into curiosity. One afternoon, the silence became too heavy. Jacob was outside splitting a formidable stack of pine logs, an activity that normally brought him grim satisfaction. Eleanor, restless and pale from confinement, emerged from the cabin, shivering slightly in the cold, and stood watching him work. "I need to work," she stated, wrapping her arms around her body. "Idleness is a luxury I cannot afford, especially knowing I'm consuming your hard-won stores. Show me how to chop wood." Jacob stopped, his axe buried deep in a stump. He stared at her, then down at his massive scarred hands, then back to her small, soft ones. The contrast absurd. "You'll hurt yourself. You'll shatter your wrist. This isn't a parlor game, Miss Hayes. This is work that requires weight, strength, and years of practice." "Then teach me properly so I won't hurt myself," she challenged, moving closer. "I refuse to remain useless. My presence caused this burden. I intend to help lighten it. I may not be strong, but I am not weak." He sighed, defeated by her logic and her insistence. He gave her a smaller hatchet, dull and manageable. He demonstrated the proper stance, the rhythm of the swing, the precise point of contact necessary to split the grain, not fight it. He emphasized safety, knowing that a single mistake could cost her a finger or a limb. Her first swings were comical, all arm strength and no body weight, the hatchet glancing harmlessly off the log, jarring her bones. She swore, a refined, shocking curse in Latin that made Jacob blink, but immediately adjusted, listening intently to his terse corrections. On the fifth try, she managed to split a small, thin piece of kindling clean through, her face, usually pale with cold, flushed with triumph. "I did it!" she beamed, the expression transforming her features from weary dignity to genuine, unbridled joy, a light that Jacob hadn't seen directed toward him in over a decade. "Don't celebrate yet," he said gruffly, though he felt a grudging admiration. "That's enough for 10 minutes of fire. We need a week's supply, but it's a start. You listen well." The simple act of shared labor, the brief, intense connection over the physics of the axe, chipped away at his isolation faster than days of conversation. Later, Eleanor took the initiative to manage their sparse meals. Jacob's cooking consisted of dropping preserved meat and dried roots into boiling water, pure function, no flavor. Eleanor, despite her history, possessed an instinctive domesticity. "We have cattail roots, wild onions, venison, and cornmeal," she observed one evening, staring at the meager ingredients. "I've never prepared food without a cook and a fully stocked larder, but I understand chemistry. We need density and flavor. I can make this edible, Mr. Vance." She surprised him again, using dried herbs Jacob had forgotten he owned, kneading the cornmeal with saved rendered fat to make rough but palatable biscuits. The cabin filled with the aroma of baking corn and simmering spice, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "This is actually quite good," Jacob admitted, taking a second biscuit, a monumental compliment from a man who considered most human speech excessive. "Thank you," she replied, a genuine smile this time. "It seems my Boston education was not entirely useless. It taught me how to manage limited resources, which, after all, is merely a different kind of commerce." One morning, Jacob was forced to admit he needed to mend a tear in his heavy buffalo coat, exposed during the recent blizzard. His hands, adept at carving and shooting, were clumsy with needle and thread, his large fingers unable to manage the delicate work. Eleanor watched for a moment, then quietly took the materials from him. "You look like you're trying to butcher the hide," she observed, her tone devoid of mockery. "I may not know how to split wood, but a proper Boston upbringing dictates knowing how to mend and tailor. It was one of the few practical skills they permitted, viewing it as a prerequisite for managing servants." She worked with unexpected speed and precision, using small, neat stitches that vanished into the fabric. The sight of her bent over his garment, her chestnut braid falling over her shoulder, introduced an element of domesticity that terrified him. When she finished, the repair was flawless. "Thank you," Jacob managed, retrieving the coat quickly, avoiding her gaze. "It will hold." "You're welcome," she replied, picking up his discarded carving knife. "Now, show me again how to hold the blade for the wing feathers." This was the true turning point, the carving lesson. Jacob carved wolves constantly, a pack of silent guardians against loneliness, each one reflecting the weary instinct that governed his life. "They're beautiful," she admitted, tracing the carved features. "So lifelike. The raw isolation of the mountain is in every line. Could you teach me?" Jacob was taken aback. "Carving's not for ladies. It's for keeping memories at bay. It's a lonely task." "Neither is fleeing marriage contracts or surviving coach crashes," she countered, leveling him with a steady gaze. "Yet, here I am," he conceded reluctantly. He taught her, their hands touching as he guided the blade, showing her how to read the wood's grain and respect the way the fiber resisted the knife. The simple act of shared effort was more intimate than any embrace. Her first attempts produced only splinters and mild profanity that would have scandalized Boston society, but she persisted, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It's terrible," she laughed, holding up a misshapen creature that vaguely resembled a small dog, or maybe a cat. "It looks like a badger that lost a fight." "It's a start," Jacob found himself saying, the words almost a smile, a movement his face hadn't made in a decade. "Tomorrow, we try pine. It's softer, more forgiving." He also taught her the necessities of survival. Their stores were running low, and the blizzard had sealed the hunting trails. He took her out to check his snares. Eleanor proved an attentive student, watching his every move with the same focus she brought to her carving. When they found a rabbit, Eleanor insisted on managing the kill. Jacob watched, impressed by her steely composure. Her hands shook, but she managed it, then stood staring at the small body with profound sadness, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I know it's necessary," she said quietly afterward, staring at the small body, "but I don't think I'll ever find it easy. I will never become indifferent to this." Jacob, the man who had walled off his own pain with indifference, found himself replying honestly, "The moment it becomes easy is the moment you lose something human. That's what I learned. Don't ever lose the sadness, Eleanor." He realized that she, in her courage, was reminding him of the part of himself he had deliberately frozen 15 years ago. Eleanor's question hung in the cold air, a challenge and a plea that cut through his carefully constructed defenses. "Is that why you live alone? To avoid losing more of your humanity? To avoid feeling anything?" The emotional reckoning was inevitable. One night, frustrated by his silence and their unnatural distance, Eleanor confronted him, her voice ringing with the anguish of her own flight. "You are terrified," she challenged him, rising to her feet, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "Not of bears or storms or dying alone. You are terrified of feeling alive again. You see me, and you see risk, not a person. You see Mary's ghost. Tell me about Mary. Tell me about the day you lost your faith, Jacob." The name broke his control. It was a dam bursting after a decade and a half of silent pressure. The words poured out. 15 years of loneliness distilled into a raw confession. He told her about Mary's kindness, her dreams for their farm, the sound of her laugh, her dedication to making their house a home, the terrible night of the labor, the realization that the doctor was useless, and the crushing weight of digging 2 graves in the frozen ground while the preacher spoke of salvation. "I buried them in the same coffin," Jacob finished, his voice raw and harsh, his hands clenched into fists, staring into the flickering embers. "Mary, holding our son, neighbors stood by, talking of God's plan, while I stood like a dead man. That night, I burned their house down and rode west until the mountains swallowed me. I left everything because everything I built was a lie. The only truth left was the fire." "But they did follow," Eleanor said softly, comprehension replacing her anger. "Every damn day. The smell of the smoke, the taste of the dirt. The difference is, Jacob, I've been running too. Running from a life where I was nothing but a commodity to be sold. We're both survivors running from our pasts." She stepped closer, breaching the invisible perimeter he'd maintained for years. "You saved my life, Jacob Vance. Not just from the snow, but from a different kind of death. A slow suffocation in silk and propriety. You're already half in love with me, just as I'm half in love with you. The only question is whether we're brave enough to admit it." The truth of her words shattered his final defenses. The years of isolation, the deliberate starvation of his heart, coalesced into a single, overwhelming need. With a sound somewhere between a groan and a prayer, Jacob pulled her into a fierce kiss, a kiss that tasted of 15 years of loneliness seeking solace, of 2 damaged people recognizing their match. The fear was still there, might always be, but the need for connection was stronger, a promise whispered against the terrifying emptiness of the world. Their moment of peace, forged in confession and sealed by the kiss, was tragically fleeting. The next morning, as they struggled to maintain boundaries now rendered meaningless, the true threat arrived. 3 riders picked their way up the mountain path. Jacob spotted them through the single-glass window, his gut clenching. He instantly recognized the disciplined bearing of the lead man, the expensive coat that looked criminally out of place against the wilderness backdrop. The 2 flanking riders had the look of hired muscle, their faces hard and impatient. "Get up to the loft, Eleanor," Jacob ordered, grabbing his rifle. "They're not local. They're looking for someone. If they're law, they won't shoot if they don't see 2 of us. I'll handle the negotiation." "No," she said, already moving to the second rifle he had taught her to clean. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady. 3 men approaching our home with unclear intentions. I'm not hiding. The risk is the same whether I'm up there or down here. I will not let you sacrifice yourself for me again." The term "our home" sent a jolt of pride and terror through Jacob. "Is it him? Richard?" Jacob stepped outside to meet the lead rider, instantly recognizing the menace beneath the polish. "Indeed, a long way from anywhere," Jacob said evenly, his rifle resting casually in his hands, though the safety was off. The cold air snapped between them. "Indeed," the rider sneered, his eyes icy blue and taking in every detail of Jacob's weathered appearance and the rough-hewn cabin. "But I'd ride through hell itself to recover stolen property. Don't see any property here, just my cabin and my mountain. And my horse, Thunder." Jacob knew the man, Richard Peyton, Eleanor's former fiancé. Peyton had traced her to the wreck and, finding her gone, had concluded Jacob was a kidnapper. But Peyton was prepared for more than a simple recovery. He wanted vengeance, and he wanted destruction. "I took the liberty of having new warrants drawn up," Peyton said, pulling out a folded paper with a flourish, the parchment looking ridiculously formal in the savage landscape. "The Hermit of Wolverine Peak, wanted for questioning in connection with a fire that killed 2 people 15 years ago. Arson and murder, Mr. Vance. It seems my family connections extend even to the archives of Kansas law." Jacob's blood ran cold. Peyton didn't just want Eleanor. He had investigated Jacob's past and was using forged warrants to neutralize him. He was leveraging Jacob's deepest, most vulnerable pain as a weapon. "Those 2 people were my wife and child," Jacob stated flatly, his voice dangerously low, resisting the urge to look at Eleanor. "The case was closed as tragedy. Your papers are worthless fabrications, Peyton." "So you say," Peyton smiled, devoid of warmth. "But a clever prosecutor might argue differently. A man who burns down his own homestead and flees across state lines raises many questions, especially when one has the funds to make those questions very loud. Questions that can lead to a hangman's noose. You know the Eastern law, Vance. Money talks. Your poverty speaks of guilt." Peyton laid out his ultimatum. Eleanor returns with him to face her family and her marriage contract, or Jacob faces trial for arson and murder. Eleanor stepped out of the cabin, chin held high, wearing Jacob's oversized coat like a battle standard, standing shoulder to shoulder with him. "My sisters are better off in the streets than sold to men like you, Richard. You won't use them against me. You won't break my family to save your own reputation." Peyton's mask slipped, rage replacing the cool calculation. "Enough. You've had your little adventure. You'll come with me now, or I'll have Mr. Vance arrested for kidnapping, assault, and whatever other charges I choose to file. You know I can make them stick." "Try it," Jacob said, leveling his rifle, the cold steel a reassuring weight in his hands. The 2 hired guns flanking Peyton tensed, hands moving toward their weapons. Everything happened at once, a sudden explosion of action in the quiet morning. Jacob shoved Eleanor behind him, bringing his rifle up. The crack of gunfire shattered the mountain silence. One hired gun spun. Clutching his shoulder, Jacob's bullet finding its mark, a clean, precise hit born of years of hunting necessity. Peyton drew a concealed pistol, aiming for Jacob, but another shot rang out, louder and closer, fired from the second rifle Eleanor held. Peyton cried out, his pistol flying from his hand, the bullet having grazed his wrist, severing the tendons. Eleanor stood steady, the cabin rifle smoking, her face white but determined. "The next one goes in your chest, Richard," she said, her voice deadly calm, stripped of any Boston softness. "What did you expect? You threatened the man I love. You threatened our home. That is a threat the mountain answers." Eleanor, the Boston socialite, was now a frontier fighter, having made her choice in the brutal language of the mountain. This single defining moment, the past catching up to Jacob and the present threat to Eleanor, changed everything. If this intense tale of courage and choice is keeping you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button now and let us know in the comments if you think Jacob and Eleanor can survive this confrontation. We'll be right back to see how they deal with the aftermath and build their new life. With the unwounded gunman's hands raised, Eleanor closed the final act of the conflict. She didn't rely on bullets alone. She relied on Richard Peyton's deepest weakness, his reputation, his ambition, and his fear of public shame. "Here's what's going to happen," she told Peyton, stepping closer, rifle unwavering, her eyes blazing with hard-won confidence. "You will leave now, and you will forget I exist. Because if you don't, I will write to every newspaper in Boston detailing exactly what kind of man you are. All those times you struck me when you'd been drinking, the bribes you paid, the names of your mistresses. My diary from our courtship makes for fascinating reading. I wonder how your Senate campaign will fare after that, Richard. I wonder how your father's business associates will handle the scandal of forged warrants and attempted kidnapping. Peyton's face went gray. He was terrified of scandal, of anything that could tarnish his gilded reputation. He'd lost. He ordered his remaining man to help the wounded one. They mounted awkwardly, beaten and humiliated. "You'll regret this when you're old and broken from hard living," Peyton spat, his final desperate threat. "You could have had everything: comfort, money, security. You chose a savage's life and a killer's fate." "I already have everything," Eleanor replied, her voice ringing with certainty, unwavering. "Everything that matters. I chose freedom, and I chose the man who taught me what courage actually looks like." The moment the riders were gone, Eleanor's rifle slipped from her grasp, and she began to shake violently, the adrenaline crashing. Jacob caught her, holding her tight against his chest. The smell of gunpowder and pine filled the air, the scent of fear and victory mingling. "You protected us," Jacob murmured into her hair. "You protected our home. You were magnificent. A force of nature, Eleanor." "I shot him," she whispered, the shock setting in. "I actually shot someone. I had to, Jacob. I couldn't lose you. Not now. I couldn't let him ruin what you built and what we found." With the immediate threat gone, Jacob made his final, complete choice, a decision forged in fire and adrenaline. He was done hiding. He was done running. "I love you," he said, the words rusty from disuse but certain, the promise a weight and a warmth in his heart. "God help me, Eleanor. I love you. I won't let fear take this away. I won't live in the past anymore. I know," she smiled through her tears. "Now let's go home and figure out what comes next. Because that life we talked about, that's real now. We earned it with those bullets, Jacob." The shadow of Jacob's past finally lifted when Sheriff Cobb rode up a few days later, having received word of the disturbance and the forged warrants. The lawman, a grizzled veteran, listened with growing disgust to the tale of Peyton's brutality and legal maneuvering, taking the statements of the two hired hands who had quickly turned on Peyton to save their own skins. "Peyton's family arranged those old Kansas warrants as leverage years ago," Cobb confirmed, having wired the authorities and done his own digging. "They didn't care about justice, only about power. But that kind of corruption doesn't fly out here. Your case is being officially closed, Mr. Vance. You're free. Completely free. Those warrants are nothing but burned paper now." He tipped his hat. "I'll see you two in town. I hear a wedding might be in order. The town needs some good news." The hermit of Wolverine Peak was free, not just in the mountains, but legally, finally cleared of the shadow that had driven him to isolation. 2 weeks later, Jacob Vance and Eleanor Hayes were married in Cedar Ridge's small church. Eleanor wore a simple dress purchased from the general store, and a few wild flowers gathered by Mrs. Cobb in her hair. Jacob had finally trimmed his beard and hair, looking almost civilized and years younger. When the Reverend asked Jacob if he took this woman, his voice caught, rough with emotion. The last time he'd made vows, he'd been young, and certain the future held only joy. Now he knew happiness was fragile, bought at a high price, but he also knew some risks were worth taking. "I do," he said, and meant it with every scarred piece of his heart. "I do." 1 year later, spring came early to the Montana mountains. Eleanor stood in the doorway of their new, larger cabin, a proper 2-story structure with a dedicated kitchen and real glass windows Jacob had hauled up the pass, working tirelessly over the past winter, her hand resting on her rounded belly, feeling the flutter of life within. She watched Jacob work with a young mare in the corral they had built together the previous summer. The man who had once feared life was now building something real, a home, a horse business named Wolverine Peak Stock, and a family. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge, initially wary of the hermit and the strange Boston bride, had come to respect them. Eleanor had started teaching reading and writing lessons, and Jacob's carved furniture was sold in the general store, a sign of his re-entry into the world. Jacob vaulted the corral fence with the easy grace of a man who no longer carried the weight of the past. He caught Eleanor, resting his hand over hers on her belly. "Margaret wrote," Eleanor smiled, referring to her sister. "Richard Peyton's career is finished, ruined by the scandal of his forged warrants and business fraud. And my father's debts were paid off by an anonymous benefactor. The rest of my family is safe. We sent them a carved wolf for protection, Jacob. They know the symbol now." "Mysterious benefactor," Jacob murmured, kissing her temple. Wonder who arranged that. I suspect it was a man done hiding who had a little money tucked away from years of isolation, a small price to pay for a full life. I've been thinking about names, Eleanor said. If it's a boy, Samuel, after your father, and we can raise him with the truth that a man's courage is his own warrant and his reputation is built on his actions, not his wealth. And if it's a girl, Jacob finished softly, his eyes shining, marry Eleanor, for both the women who made me whole. She will know her strength comes from her mother's will and the memory of the woman who taught me how to love again. They stood on the rise overlooking the valley, the world greening and softening under the spring sun. They had faced the storm, the past, and the price of the life they chose. True safety wasn't about isolation. It was about facing the world together with a full heart. Regrets, Eleanor teased, echoing her old question, knowing the answer. Only that I wasted so many years, Jacob admitted, pulling her close, the scent of hay and honest labor replacing the ghosts of smoke and whiskey. But maybe I needed those years to be broken, to be ready for this, for you. You taught me how to live again. You gave me back my soul. You are my home, Eleanor. The hermit had found his home, and the heiress had found her freedom. Their love was not an easy comfort, but a hard-won covenant, built in the shadow of death and secured by choice. If this story of redemption and true courage resonated with you, subscribe right now, and tell me in the comments below. If you were Eleanor, knowing the risks, would you have chosen the comfort of Boston or the wild freedom of the mountain?